Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history doesn't shout, it confesses and whispers. Tonight, we invite you to settle in for a story that even the Mafia struggled to contain. The story of Joseph Barboza, a man they didn't call quiet. They called him the animal. He wasn't a boss. He wasn't a strategist. He wasn't even trusted. He was something far more dangerous. A killer so unstable, so violent, that both the Mafia and the government believed they could use him, and both would later regret it. Before we disappear into this story, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? We love watching this underworld grow quietly across countries, borders, and sleepless nights. And if you find comfort in drifting off to the darker corners of history, stories told slowly, carefully, without noise or distraction, consider subscribing to Outlaw Icons. It helps this channel survive, and it ensures these stories continue to be told calmly, accurately, and without interruption. Now, take a deep breath. Let the weight of the day loosen its grip. Let the outside world fade, because this story does not begin with loyalty, or honor, or power. It begins with fear. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1, Born into Violence. The scream came from behind a closed door, sharp enough to cut through the thin walls of a Somerville triple-decker, sharp enough that neighbors paused mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-breath. No one knocked. No one intervened. In that neighborhood, screams were weather. They came and went. Inside that apartment, a small boy learned his first lesson about the world. Pain arrived without warning, and silence was the only defense. Joseph Barboza entered the world in 1930, not with promise or celebration, but with tension already hanging in the air. Somerville, Massachusetts, sat just north of Boston like a clenched jaw, packed tight with working-class families, many of them immigrants or children of immigrants, all of them pressed together by poverty, pride, and unspoken rules. Homes were loud, walls were thin, tempers were shorter than the winters were long. His father ruled the household with fists and fury, a man who drank to forget his failures and remembered them anyway. His mother learned early that love could not always protect a child. The apartment smelled of cigarettes, sweat, and old anger. Voices rose. Objects flew. And somewhere between the slammed doors and bruised knuckles, a boy learned that violence did not arrive as chaos. It arrived as routine. Joseph was small, quiet, and watchful. He did not cry when hit. He learned quickly that tears only made things worse. Instead, he absorbed punishment like a sponge, storing it somewhere deep and dark. Other children learned to read faces to avoid trouble. Joseph learned to read exits, corners, weapons. He learned where to stand, so blows landed softer. He learned when to strike back. School offered no refuge. Teachers saw a boy who stared too long and spoke too little. Other children sensed something off, something sharp beneath the surface. He fought often, over insults that others would have ignored, over slights that existed only in his mind. When adults asked why, he could not explain it. The anger felt older than language. By his early teens, violence followed him like a shadow that grew longer with the sun. Street fights turned into ambushes. Rocks turned into knives. Knuckles turned into tools. Police began to recognize his face, not yet as a criminal, but as a problem. A boy who did not scare easily. A boy who did not back down. Reform school arrived like a sentence rather than a solution. Long hallways. Locked doors. Authority enforced with rigid rules and harsher consequences. For some boys, it was a chance to reset. For Joseph, it was confirmation. This was the world as it truly was. Power belonged to those who took it. Respect followed fear. And mercy was a myth told by people who had never needed it. Inside those walls, he hardened. Violence became less emotional, more deliberate. Less explosive, more efficient. He learned how to hurt without leaving marks. How to wait. How to watch. How to smile while planning something else entirely. Other boys bragged about crimes they hoped to commit one day. Joseph listened. He remembered. He cataloged. When he returned to Somerville, he was no longer just angry. He was calibrated. The streets recognized the change before the adults did. Word traveled quietly, the way it always does in places where survival depends on information. There was a kid who didn't hesitate, a kid who didn't bluff, a kid who didn't care how things ended, as long as he wasn't the one on the ground. Crime did not tempt him. It felt inevitable. Small robberies came first, clumsy and desperate. Then bolder ones, breaking into places not for money, but for the feeling, the control, the certainty that for a few moments he dictated the outcome. Each act stripped away another layer of restraint. Each success reinforced the lesson learned at home and in reform school. Violence worked. By the time organized crime brushed past his life, Joseph was already fluent in its most brutal language. He did not need to be recruited. He needed only opportunity. The underworld did not create him. It noticed him. Men older than him watched from doorways and parked cars. They saw a young man who did not posture, did not boast, did not waste energy. A man who could be pointed in a direction and trusted to follow through. That kind of person was dangerous, but useful. Like fire, hard to control, impossible to ignore. Joseph felt no loyalty to family, neighborhood, or tradition. Those concepts had failed him early. What he understood was transaction, action and result, cause and effect. If you hurt someone badly enough, they stayed hurt. If you scared someone deeply enough, they stayed afraid. It was simple, honest, cleaner than promises. At night, he slept lightly, if at all. His dreams were not nightmares, so much as rehearsals. Running through alleys, doors slamming, the sound of breathing changing when fear took hold. He woke calm, already alert, already prepared. The day did not surprise him. It rarely could. Police pressure increased. Arrests followed. Short sentences. Longer records. Each time, the system tried to correct him. Each time, it misunderstood the problem. He was not rebelling against authority. He had simply never believed in it. There was a look people began to notice. A stillness behind the eyes. A lack of hesitation that made others uneasy. When trouble started, Joseph did not escalate. He finished. That distinction mattered. It separated him from hotheads and amateurs. It marked him as something else. Violence was no longer an outburst. It was a tool. And like any tool, it became more effective with use. Those who crossed him rarely did so twice. Those who survived carried stories they did not tell loudly. Fear followed him now, not as a reaction, but as anticipation. People adjusted their behavior before he arrived. That was power. Quiet, invisible, but absolute. He did not see himself as cruel. Cruelty implied enjoyment. This was necessity. This was balance. In his mind, the world had already drawn first blood. He was only responding. As his reputation grew, so did the distance between him and everyone else. Friends drifted away. Family contact faded. There was nothing left to anchor him to ordinary life. No job he could hold. No relationship he could maintain. Only motion. Only escalation. By his early 20s, Joseph Barboza was already what he would always be. Not a gangster rising through ranks. Not a soldier waiting for orders. But a weapon looking for a hand to hold it. The Mafia would eventually offer that hand. Not because they trusted him, but because they believed they could point him away from themselves. They were wrong. And somewhere in the quiet streets of Somerville, a boy who had learned to survive by absorbing pain had grown into a man who no longer absorbed anything at all. He delivered it. The violence that defined his childhood had not scarred him into submission. It had sharpened him. And soon, the underworld would discover that once sharpened, some blades never stopped cutting. The real story had not even begun yet. And already, it was out of control. Chapter 2. The Making of the Animal. The first time someone whispered the name, it wasn't spoken with admiration. It was spoken the way people talk about storms forming offshore, low and cautious, as if saying it louder might bring it closer. The Animal. Not a nickname earned in celebration, but a warning passed quietly from mouth to ear. By then, Joseph Barboza was no longer just violent. He was unpredictable, and unpredictability, in the criminal world, is more frightening than cruelty. He moved through Somerville and the surrounding neighborhoods like a pressure change in the air. You didn't always see him coming, but you felt it when he was near. Conversations shortened. Eyes shifted. People recalculated where they stood, what they said, how long they lingered. He wasn't loud. He didn't posture. He didn't need to. The stillness around him did the work. This was the phase of his life where violence stopped being reactive and became intentional, where anger stopped boiling over and began simmering, controlled, ready. He had learned something crucial in reform school and on the streets afterward. Chaos attracts attention. Precision invites silence. If you want to keep operating, you didn't explode. You executed. He studied people the way a mechanic studies engines. Where they hesitated. What made their voice crack? How fear changed their breathing. He noticed how most men talked tough until the moment arrived, then folded inward, suddenly concerned with consequences. Joseph had no such concerns. Consequences were abstract. Pain was immediate. He lived in the immediate. Robberies grew more calculated. He didn't rush in anymore. He watched routines, learned patterns, counted steps, doors, shadows. The crime itself was rarely the point. The point was control, entering someone else's space and bending it to his will, leaving behind a message that didn't need words. When violence came, it came fast. No shouting, no threats, just action. Victims later struggled to explain what happened, only that it felt sudden, overwhelming, final, like being caught under something heavy that didn't speak or hesitate. The stories traveled. They always do. And with each retelling, the fear grew legs. Police noticed him more often now. His name appeared in reports, then in files, then in conversations held behind desks late at night. Officers disagreed on what to do with him. Some thought he was just another angry young man who would burn out or die young. Others sensed something colder, something that didn't fade with age. Arrests came and went. Short stints behind bars hardened him further, but not in the way most people expect. Jail didn't intimidate him. It clarified things. Inside, he saw the same hierarchies as the street, only stripped of pretense. Strength mattered, reputation mattered, and violence was currency. He paid with interest. Other inmates avoided him, not because he was the biggest, but because he was the least restrained. Men who lived by codes and alliances sensed that Joseph did not play by the same rules. He did not care about lineage, or loyalty, or tradition. He cared about outcomes. That made him dangerous, even to criminals. When he got out, he didn't celebrate freedom. He adjusted strategy. He learned which crimes drew heat and which slipped through the cracks. He learned which victims fought back and which froze. He learned how to disappear in neighborhoods that already knew his face. It was around this time that organized crime truly began to take notice. Not in a formal way, not with sit-downs or invitations, but with glances, questions asked indirectly, jobs offered without obligation. The underworld has a way of testing people before trusting them. Small tasks, dirty tasks, things no one else wants to do. Joseph did them without complaint. He wasn't being groomed. He was being evaluated, and he didn't realize it first. To him, it was just more work, more opportunities to exercise what he already knew how to do. But to those watching, it was something else entirely. Proof of concept. They saw how he handled pressure, how he didn't flinch when plans went wrong, how he didn't panic when things got messy. Most importantly, they saw how little he talked afterward. No bragging, no loose words. Silence followed him like a second skin. But there was a problem, a serious one. Joseph did not stop when most men would. He didn't pull back when a message had been sent. He often went further, too far. Violence, once unleashed, didn't always retreat cleanly. Bodies lingered. Evidence accumulated. Attention followed. He was efficient, but not subtle. Controlled, but not restrained. That tension defined this chapter of his life. The thing that made him valuable was the same thing that made him risky. He was a hammer that didn't know when to stop swinging. And the Mafia, cautious by nature, does not like tools it cannot put down. Still, they kept using him. Each job pushed him deeper into the criminal ecosystem. Each success brought him closer to men who spoke softly and expected results. Men who had grown up in a different criminal culture, one built on hierarchy, ritual, and long memory. They saw Joseph as an outsider, Useful, but not one of them. He felt that distance. He resented it, not because he wanted acceptance, but because he understood what it meant. Protection was selective. Loyalty was conditional. If things went wrong, he would be the first to be offered up. That knowledge fed his paranoia. He trusted no one, slept lightly, changed routines constantly. He began to believe, not without reason, that everyone was watching him, waiting, planning. The line between caution and obsession blurred. Violence, once his tool, became his reflex again. There were incidents that even hardened criminals whispered about. Attacks that felt excessive. Punishments that felt personal. Men beaten long after they stopped resisting. Situations where Joseph seemed less interested in resolution than domination. The animal wasn't just a nickname anymore. It was a diagnosis. Those around him started to pull back. Slowly, carefully. No one wanted to be the one who offended him. But no one wanted to be too close either. Being near Joseph meant being near chaos. And chaos attracts law enforcement the way blood attracts sharks. The police pressure intensified. Surveillance increased. Informants began to murmur. Files thickened. The streets tightened. Joseph felt it in the way cars lingered. In the way faces he didn't recognize appeared too often. In the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. He responded the only way he knew how. He became more dangerous. Mistakes followed. Not technical ones. Emotional ones. He struck when he should have waited. He escalated when patience would have served him better. His paranoia fed his brutality, and his brutality fed the scrutiny around him. Those who had once seen him as an asset began to see him as a liability. Not openly. Not yet. But the shift had begun. Quietly. Invisibly. The way these things always do. Joseph sensed it. He felt the change in tone. The subtle withdrawal. Jobs dried up. Information slowed. Doors that once opened now stayed closed just a second longer. He had survived abandonment before. It had taught him something simple. When you're pushed to the edge, you push back harder. He began operating more independently, taking risks others wouldn't. He didn't need permission. He didn't need backup. Or so he told himself. In reality, isolation was closing in around him. And isolation makes even the strongest men reckless. Violence followed him like a wake behind a ship, each act leaving ripples that spread outward, touching people he would never meet. Families, neighborhoods, police departments, prosecutors. Everyone felt it. Everyone adjusted. Joseph Barboza was no longer just a violent criminal. He was a problem with momentum, a man whose actions were beginning to force decisions on everyone around him, including people far more powerful than he realized. He believed fear made him untouchable. He was half right. Fear bought time, but it also painted targets. As this chapter of his life closed, Joseph stood at a dangerous crossroads. Too violent to trust, too useful to discard, too unstable to control. The underworld had created many monsters over the years, but this one had grown without permission. And soon, someone would decide what to do about it. The animal was no longer just prowling. He was being hunted. Chapter 3. Enter the Winter Hill Gang. The night Joseph Barboza truly crossed the threshold, no one announced it. There was no ceremony, no handshake sealing allegiance, no speech about loyalty or brotherhood. Just a quiet understanding, shared between men who had learned long ago that the most important decisions are rarely spoken aloud. One moment, he was operating on the fringes of the criminal world, tolerated but watched. The next, he was inside its bloodstream, moving with it, feeding it, poisoning it. Winter Hill did not look like an empire. It never needed to. It looked like parked cars that stayed too long, like social clubs with curtains always half drawn. Like men who laughed easily but watched everything. Power there was understated, almost modest, wrapped in working-class accents and local routines. Outsiders mistook that humility for weakness. They rarely made that mistake twice. Joseph sensed the shift before he could name it. Jobs began coming through intermediaries. Messages delivered casually, almost carelessly, as if the stakes were small. They weren't. Each task was a test, not of loyalty, but of restraint. Not of courage, but of discretion. They wanted to see if the animal could be taught to walk on a leash. At first, it seemed to work. He followed instructions, more or less. He learned to wait for signals. Learned that silence afterward mattered more than speed beforehand. Learned that violence was only valuable if it served a purpose larger than the moment itself. These lessons didn't come naturally to him, but he understood their logic. Winter Hill valued control. Chaos was expensive. The men watching him weren't sentimental. They didn't care about his childhood, his scars, his anger. They cared about outcomes, about whether problems stayed solved, about whether bodies stayed hidden, about whether attention drifted away instead of gathering. Joseph delivered results, and results in that world by patience. But patience has limits. Winter Hill was built on a delicate balance. Irish muscle, Italian oversight, unspoken boundaries negotiated over decades. It survived because it knew when to push and when to pull back. Joseph knew only how to push. Even when he followed orders, he left fingerprints in the air. Fear lingered too long. Rumors traveled too far. Still, they kept him close. Because for certain problems, finesse was a liability. There were moments when subtlety failed, when messages needed to be unmistakable, when hesitation invited retaliation. That was when Joseph was useful. He brought finality. He did not socialize easily with the group. He was present, but never relaxed. Conversations flowed around him, not through him. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was clipped, practical, unadorned. He didn't tell stories. He didn't joke. He didn't reminisce. Those habits made others uneasy. Men trust those who share their memories. Joseph carried his like weapons. There was an unspoken hierarchy, and he felt himself hovering just outside it. Allowed in rooms, but never fully welcomed. Trusted with tasks, but not with strategy. Used, but not embraced. It gnawed at him in ways he didn't fully understand. He didn't crave belonging, but he despised being underestimated. Winter Hill leaders debated him quietly. Some argued he was an asset that needed refining. Others saw a liability that would eventually draw blood in the wrong direction. Both were right, and neither knew what to do about it yet. Joseph's paranoia deepened. He began reading subtext where none existed. A pause in conversation felt like judgment. A missed call felt like betrayal. He trusted no one fully, least of all the men who controlled access to protection. He started carrying himself like a man already cornered. Violence crept back into his behavior, less controlled than before. He lingered too long at scenes. He struck harder than necessary. He sent messages that echoed beyond their intended audience. Winter Hill noticed. So did law enforcement. Police surveillance intensified in the neighborhoods Joseph frequented. Cars idled at intersections. Plainclothes officers leaned against storefronts pretending to read newspapers. Informants whispered about a man who didn't know when to stop. A man who scared even other criminals. The gang tried to rein him in. Subtle warnings at first. Suggestions framed as advice. Slower jobs. Less exposure. Joseph nodded. He listened. Then he ignored half of it. Not out of defiance, but instinct. When pressure increased, he reverted to what had always worked for him. Force. The tension inside Winter Hill thickened. Some members began distancing themselves, careful not to be seen with him too often. Others defended him, pointing to his effectiveness. Arguments broke out behind closed doors. Joseph was rarely mentioned by name. He didn't need to be. Everyone knew who they were talking about. He sensed the shift. The invitation stopped. The information slowed. He was being frozen out. Not expelled, but sidelined. And in that world, sidelining was the prelude to sacrifice. Joseph responded the only way he knew how. He doubled down, took jobs without approval, settled disputes personally, sent messages he thought would remind everyone of his value. Instead, they confirmed everyone's fears. Winter Hill had always prided itself on surviving by adaptation. It understood that power wasn't about domination, but continuity. Joseph threatened continuity, not intentionally, inevitably. The Mafia watched all of this from a distance. Italian crews had long tolerated Winter Hill's independence. so long as boundaries were respected. Joseph's behavior blurred those lines. His violence didn't always stay contained within Irish territory. That made him a problem for more than one organization. Whispers began circulating in higher circles about a man who couldn't be trusted, about a weapon that might turn inward, about a liability masquerading as an asset. The same whispers reached law enforcement, carried by different mouths for different reasons. Joseph felt eyes everywhere now. In reflections, in windows, in passing cars. He slept less, drank more, moved constantly. He believed everyone was waiting for him to make a mistake. He was right, and he was already making them. The irony was cruel. The very gang that had given him legitimacy was now debating how to survive him. The very structure that had tried to harness his violence was being strained by it. Winter Hill had opened the door. Now was deciding whether to close it quietly or slam it shut. Joseph stood at the center of it all, unaware of how close he was to becoming expendable. He believed fear still protected him. He believed his reputation made him untouchable. He did not yet understand that reputations can be reassigned. That fear, once it outweighs usefulness, becomes justification. As this chapter of his life drew toward its breaking point, alliances shifted around him like tectonic plates. Quietly, slowly, with catastrophic potential, Joseph Barboza had entered Winter Hill as a tool. He was becoming something else entirely. A risk. And in the criminal underworld, risks are not managed. They are eliminated. The question was no longer whether Joseph would fall. It was who would push first. Chapter 4. Murder as Currency. The first killing that mattered didn't come with ceremony or drama. No shouting. No chase. No witnesses gathered at windows. It ended quietly, the way Joseph Barboza preferred things to end, with a man collapsing into himself as if his strings had been cut. The moment passed almost unnoticed by the city, but something fundamental shifted in Joseph's world. Violence was no longer just instinct or release. It had become leverage. In the criminal underworld, there are many ways to earn status. Money buys comfort. Connections buy protection. But murder buys silence. And Joseph understood silence better than most men understood words. He learned quickly that killing changed how people spoke around him. Not louder, softer. Sentences shortened. Requests became suggestions. Suggestions became deference. The air around him thickened with caution. Fear, once accidental, became deliberate. Joseph didn't talk about the killing afterward. He didn't need to. The absence of explanation was part of the message. People filled in the blanks themselves, and imagination did more work than confession ever could. The man who died became less important than the idea of why he died. That idea spread. Murder, Joseph realized, functioned like a dark form of currency. Spend it wisely, and it bought you time. Spend it recklessly, and it attracted attention. He believed he was being careful. Others disagreed. Winter Hill began using him differently now, not as muscle for intimidation, but as a final measure. When threats failed, when debts lingered too long, when someone refused to understand the unspoken rules, Joseph was sent not to negotiate, but to conclude. Each assignment tightened the knot around him. The jobs grew heavier, dirtier, more irreversible. Bodies meant investigations. Investigations meant pressure. Pressure meant paranoia. And paranoia fed Joseph's worst instincts. He started carrying weapons constantly, not for defense, for readiness. The line between work and reflex blurred. He began to see threats where there were none. A look held too long. A pause before an answer. A question asked twice. Everything felt like a test. Some killings were sanctioned. Others were not. This distinction mattered deeply to the men above him. To Joseph, it mattered less. In his mind, violence preempted betrayal. Strike first, and there would be no second move to worry about. That thinking unsettled Winter Hill leadership. They believed in order, in sequence, in permission. Joseph believed in momentum. Once violence started, he didn't always know how to stop it, or want to. There were murmurs about excess, about jobs that went too far, about people hurt who were never supposed to be touched. Each whisper carried risk. not just of retaliation, but of exposure. Murder was supposed to solve problems, not multiply them. Joseph heard the murmurs, but he interpreted them as weakness. He had lived his entire life believing hesitation invited harm. Now men who claimed authority were asking for restraint. It felt like betrayal of logic itself. Law enforcement felt the shift too. Detectives noticed patterns. Crimes connected by proximity, by method, by rumor. Witnesses didn't come forward, but fear has a way of shaping silence into something recognizable. They didn't know Joseph's name yet, not fully, but they knew there was someone out there who didn't operate like the others. Joseph's reputation grew, but it grew unevenly. Among criminals, inspired fear. Among law enforcement, suspicion. Among Winter Hill, anxiety. He was becoming too visible without being seen, too present without being named. The killings weighed on him in unexpected ways. Not guilt, never guilt, but vigilance. Sleep became shallow. Dreams became fragmented. He replayed moments over and over, searching for mistakes. A sound, a movement, a face he might have missed. His mind never rested. It sharpened. He began drinking more, not to forget, but to slow the noise. Alcohol dulled the edges just enough to function, but it also loosened control. Moments slipped. Temper flared faster. Violence crept closer to the surface again. Winter Hill attempted course correction. They limited his assignments, reduced his exposure, tried to distance themselves from his most extreme actions. Joseph noticed. He felt the leash tighten, and like any animal who has learned survival through force, he pulled. He took initiative where none was given, settled disputes without approval, delivered punishments no one had ordered. In his mind, he was proving his value. In reality, he was confirming fears. Murder stopped being a tool and became a habit, not in frequency, but in readiness. He lived in a state where killing felt like an option always on the table. That mindset is corrosive. It eats at judgment. It distorts threat assessment. Everything begins to look like justification. The Mafia families watching from the periphery began taking notice. Italian crews had tolerated Winter Hill's methods because they understood its discipline. Joseph threatened that understanding. His violence did not always respect boundaries. Territory, lineage, permission, these were abstractions to him. Fear was universal. That universality made him dangerous beyond his station. A man who kills without regard for structure destabilizes structure itself. Organized crime depends on predictability. Joseph introduced volatility. There were conversations held in rooms Joseph would never enter. Decisions framed carefully. Options weighed. Some argued he was still useful. Others believed he was already lost. All agreed on one thing. He could not continue unchecked. Joseph sensed the shift, but misread its cause. He believed they feared him because he was effective. He did not realize they feared him because he was uncontrollable. There is a difference, and it is fatal. By now, murder had fully replaced trust as Joseph's negotiating tool. He didn't build alliances. He enforced compliance. That strategy works until it doesn't. Fear secures obedience, but it also breeds plotting. People begin to look for exits, for shields, for ways to redirect the storm. Joseph believed himself untouchable. His body count felt like armor. Each death another layer. He did not see the cracks forming underneath. The killings attracted more than whispers now. They attracted leverage. Prosecutors began hearing names. Detectives compared notes. Files thickened. The system, slow but persistent, started turning its attention toward the source. Joseph felt boxed in. He didn't know by whom or from where, only that the walls were moving. When that feeling took hold, his violence escalated again. Not in number, but in intensity. He wanted to remind everyone what happened when pressure was applied. That instinct, more than any single murder, sealed his fate. Murder had bought him currency, but he had overspent. The balance was turning, and soon, the debt would be called in. Joseph Barboza believed he was trading death for safety. He didn't realize he was trading it for exposure, and the bill was coming due. Chapter 5: Crossing the Mafia Line. The first time Joseph Barboza realized he had crossed the line, no one confronted him. No warning came. No threat was delivered. Instead, there was a change in temperature. Rooms cooled when he entered. Conversations thinned. The familiar looseness of criminal camaraderie tightened into something brittle and watchful. This was not Winter Hill anymore. This was something older, something less forgiving. The Mafia did not announce itself the way street gangs did. It did not posture loudly. It observed. It cataloged. It waited. And Joseph, for all his instincts, had walked into its orbit without fully understanding the gravity that came with it. At first, the contact was indirect. A message passed through someone else. A name mentioned in passing. A task framed as a favor rather than an order. These were not requests meant to be refused. They were feelers, testing not obedience but boundaries. Joseph responded the way he always did. He completed the work. He left nothing unresolved. He did not ask questions. That efficiency impressed some, alarmed others. The Mafia had rules Winter Hill treated more like guidelines. Hierarchy mattered. Permission mattered. Timing mattered. Violence was a language spoken fluently, but sparingly. When Joseph acted, he spoke too loudly. Not in words, but in consequences. Bodies fell in ways that echoed. Joseph felt the difference immediately. These men did not fear him the way others did. Not openly. Their fear, when it appeared, was cold and measured, wrapped in calculation. They did not flinch. They evaluated. That unsettled him more than panic ever could. He was useful to them. That much was clear. An outsider willing to do what insiders could not. A deniable asset. A blunt instrument applied where subtlety would complicate matters. Joseph understood the appeal. He had always existed outside structures. Now that outsider status became leverage. But leverage cuts both ways. He noticed how Italian crews never fully brought him inside. Meetings happened without him. Decisions were made elsewhere. He was summoned when needed, dismissed when finished. There were no shared meals, no shared stories, no shared futures. He was a tool laid carefully on the table and picked up only when required. Joseph told himself he preferred it that way. Less attachment meant less vulnerability. But the truth was harder. He was being tolerated, not trusted, and tolerance in that world is temporary. Ethnic lines ran deep in the Boston underworld. Irish gangs had always operated in the shadow of Italian families, sometimes in cooperation, sometimes in conflict. Winter Hill walked a careful line, respecting boundaries while asserting independence. Joseph ignored boundaries entirely. His violence did not distinguish between lineage and convenience. That made him dangerous to everyone. The Mafia watched closely. They tracked his movements. They listened to the stories. They noticed how law enforcement attention followed him like a wake. They understood something Winter Hill was only beginning to accept. Joseph Barboza was not just violent. He was destabilizing. Joseph, meanwhile, felt a strange mix of empowerment and isolation. Being called upon by Italian crews validated his reputation. It meant his name carried weight beyond his neighborhood, but also meant his margin for error shrank. Every mistake now carried consequences beyond immediate retaliation. He began to sense invisible tripwires, unspoken expectations, looks that lingered too long, silence that stretched too far. He adjusted by becoming more guarded, more suspicious. Trust, already scarce, evaporated entirely. Violence became even more transactional. Each act weighed against potential fallout. He tried to learn restraint. He failed more often than he succeeded. Old habits resurfaced under pressure. When threatened, he escalated. When uncertain, he struck. There were moments when a Mafia considered eliminating him outright. Those conversations happened quietly, in rooms where voices stayed low and decisions carried generational weight. But each time, someone argued for delay. He was still useful, still deniable, still someone else's problem. That calculation saved him. For now, Winter Hill felt the squeeze. Italian pressure increased. Questions were asked. Warnings delivered in careful tones. Joseph's actions were no longer just Winter Hill's responsibility. They rippled outward, threatening arrangements that had held for years. Winter Hill leaders confronted Joseph indirectly. They asked him to slow down, to coordinate, to wait for approval. Joseph heard the words, but felt the subtext. He was being blamed, positioned, prepared. His paranoia hardened into certainty. He believed Winter Hill would sacrifice him to preserve their relationship with the Mafia. He believed the Mafia would dispose of him once his usefulness expired. He believed law enforcement was closing in. All three beliefs were correct. Living inside that triangle of threat warped his perception further. Every interaction felt staged. Every kindness felt conditional. He began carrying himself like a man already sentenced. That posture, more than any rumor, sealed his isolation. Violence followed him into Mafia territory now, not always by his choosing. Old disputes resurfaced. New ones ignited. Joseph found himself blamed for tensions he did not create, but could not escape. His name became shorthand for chaos. The Mafia did not tolerate chaos. It studied it, contained it, removed it. Joseph sensed the countdown without knowing the number. He slept less, trusted no one, moved constantly. He began planning contingencies, escape routes, alibis, leverage of his own. For the first time, the idea of survival shifted. It was no longer about fear alone. It was about information, knowledge. Who knew what? Who was vulnerable? Who might trade protection for silence? That realization marked a subtle but profound change. Joseph Barboza, the man who had always relied on violence as his primary language, began to consider another one. Secrets. He did not yet understand how dangerous that thought was. He only knew the old methods were failing. Fear had carried him far, but it had also narrowed his options. He was boxed in by his own reputation. The Mafia line he had crossed was not geographic. It was philosophical. He had entered a world where violence was governed by memory, not impulse, where men lived long lives by avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. Joseph brought unnecessary blood wherever he went, and blood leaves stains. As this chapter closed, Joseph stood between worlds. No longer fully Winter Hill, never truly Mafia. A man too violent to trust, too useful to discard, too visible to ignore. The ground beneath him shifted daily, silently, inexorably. He believed he could still fight his way out. He did not yet realize that the fight ahead would not be physical, and that violence, for the first time in his life, might not be enough. Chapter 6: The Kill That Changed Everything. The moment that changed everything did not feel different at first. There was no thunderclap, no sudden realization, no instinctive sense that a line had been crossed beyond repair. It felt like every other moment that had come before it. Tense, quiet, deliberate. Another problem, another decision, another act meant to protect Joseph Barboza from a world that had never protected him. That was the lie he told himself. The truth was harsher. This killing did not buy him safety. It did not reinforce fear in a way that could be controlled. It did not settle a dispute cleanly. Instead, it ruptured something fundamental. It shifted Joseph from being dangerous to being intolerable. The man who died that night was not just another name whispered afterward. He was connected, not powerful in the way Joseph understood power, not violent in the way Joseph respected violence, but connected in the way that mattered most in organized crime. He existed within a web of understandings, favors, and long memories. Removing him was not just an act of force. It was a disruption of balance. Joseph did not fully grasp that balance. He had never needed to. His world had always been immediate. Cause and effect measured in seconds, not years. He saw a threat, or imagined one, and he acted. That instinct had saved his life more times than he could count. But this time, it set a slow, grinding mechanism into motion. The killing itself was efficient, almost cold. No excess, no hesitation. Joseph later replayed it in his mind, not with pride, but with a detached assessment. What went right? What could have gone wrong? He did not dwell on the victim. He never did. Faces faded. Outcomes remained. What lingered was the silence afterward. Not the fearful silence he was used to. Not the kind that followed when people were too afraid to speak. This was different. It was absence. Phones that did not ring. Messages that did not arrive. Doors that did not open. The world did not recoil. It withdrew. Joseph felt it within days. Winter Hill contacts stopped returning calls. Jobs evaporated. Familiar intermediaries suddenly became difficult to reach. When he didn't encounter people, their eyes avoided his. Not out of fear, but calculation. As if they were already adjusting to a version of the future where he was no longer present. That unsettled him more than any threat ever had. He went looking for reassurance. Subtly at first. Casual inquiries. Light touches. He was careful not to appear desperate. Desperation attracts predators. He framed his questions as curiosity, his movements as routine. But the answers never came. Only deflections. Delays. Vague reassurances that felt rehearsed. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made. Winter Hill leadership understood immediately that the killing had gone too far. It wasn't just the body. It was the context, the timing, the connections, the inevitable attention it would bring from Italian crews who valued predictability above all else. Joseph had not just created a problem. He had created a liability that could not be explained away. The Mafia's response was quieter, colder. They did not rage. They did not threaten. They assessed. A man like Joseph could not be corrected. He could not be trusted to wait, to ask, to accept limits. He was not governed by tradition or loyalty. He was governed by fear and impulse. That made him unusable in the long term. But killing him outright was complicated. Joseph knew too much. Not secrets in the traditional sense. Not names or structures he could recite cleanly. But patterns, behaviors, faces, habits. Killing him risked attention, risked retaliation, risked questions no one wanted asked. So they waited. Joseph felt a weighting like pressure in his chest. The silence became unbearable. He began to imagine scenarios, ambushes, setups, meetings designed to eliminate him. Every invitation felt like a trap. Every delay felt like confirmation. He started carrying weapons constantly again, abandoning the restraint he had tried to learn. Old habits resurfaced with a vengeance. He changed routes, switched cars, slept in different places. He was living like a hunted man because, finally, he was one. The paranoia fed his isolation. Isolation fed his paranoia. It became a closed loop. He trusted no one. He believed everyone was compromised. And in that belief, he began to make choices that accelerated his downfall. He confronted people who had avoided him. Not aggressively, but insistently. He demanded clarity, loyalty, assurance. Each confrontation confirmed the same thing. He was no longer protected. No one said it outright. They didn't have to. Their hesitation spoke louder than threats. Joseph's reputation, once his shield, began to work against him. The very fear he had cultivated made people less willing to defend him. Associating with him now carried too much risk. He had become radioactive. Law enforcement felt the shift as well. Tips surfaced, not full confessions, not clean narratives, just fragments, hints, enough to suggest that someone violent, unstable, and increasingly isolated was at the center of several unresolved crimes. The attention sharpened. Joseph responded the way he always had when pressure mounted. He struck preemptively. Not another killing. Not yet. But intimidation. Threats. Displays meant to remind people that he was still dangerous. Still capable. Still not to be dismissed. The effect was the opposite of what he intended. Fear does not create loyalty when people believe you're already doomed. Winter Hill began distancing itself publicly, quietly redirecting blame, allowing rumors to circulate, letting law enforcement draw conclusions they did not correct. Joseph noticed his name being spoken differently now, as if it belonged to someone already gone. The Mafia made its decision not long after. Not to kill him, not yet, but to cut him loose completely. No protection, no mediation, no restraint placed on others who might want him gone. He was on his own. Joseph sensed the finality of it without being told. He understood the logic. He had always understood how this world worked. He had simply believed he was exempt from its limits. For the first time in his life, violence failed him. He could not fight an absence. He could not threaten silence into breaking. He could not kill his way back into a structure that no longer wanted him. The realization gnawed at him. Everything he had built his survival around was collapsing. That was when a new thought entered his mind. Not violence, not escape, leverage. Joseph Barboza had spent his life believing that fear was the ultimate currency. That murder bought safety. That brutality commanded respect. Now he saw the truth emerging in the shadows. Fear was only powerful when someone needed you alive. And suddenly no one did. He began thinking about what he possessed that others wanted more than his silence. What could buy him time? Protection. A way out that did not involve waiting to be killed. Information. Names. Stories. Connections. He did not yet know how to use them. He did not trust the people who might want them. But the idea lodged itself in his mind and refused to leave. The kill that changed everything did not end a life. It ended an illusion. Joseph Barboza was no longer a weapon. He was a problem. And problems, in that world, are either erased or repurposed. The next move would decide which. Chapter 7. Arrest, Isolation, and Panic. The arrest did not come with flashing lights or a dramatic chase through city streets. It arrived the way inevitability always does, quietly, efficiently, without emotion. One moment, Joseph Barboza was moving through his day with the tight vigilance of a hunted man. The next, the world narrowed to cold hands, measured voices, and the unmistakable click of steel closing around his wrists. No shouting, no resistance. He understood immediately that this was not a warning. This was containment. Inside the police car, the city slid past the windows like something he had already left behind. Streets he knew by instinct. Corners where he had stood for hours watching patterns unfold. Doorways that once offered cover now offered nothing. The vehicle smelled of vinyl and stale coffee. The officer driving did not look at him. The one in the passenger seat checked a clipboard and said nothing. That silence told Joseph everything. This wasn't about one crime. This was about him. At the station, time lost its shape. Hours stretched and collapsed without warning. Paperwork moved faster than expected. Names were read. Charges stacked. Each word added weight. He listened without reacting, his face carefully neutral, but inside something began to fracture. This was not the system he had known before. This was not a short sentence, not a temporary setback. This was something larger, coordinated, deliberate. In the holding cell, the noise of the building faded into a low mechanical hum. Footsteps echoed down corridors. Doors opened and closed with dull finality. Joseph sat on the bench and stared at the wall, tracing invisible lines with his eyes. He had always believed he understood pressure. This was different. Pressure usually came with direction. This felt like suspension. Word traveled fast on the outside. Faster than he expected. Faster than he wanted. By the time night fell, people already knew he was off the street. Some reacted with relief. Others with calculation. A few with anticipation. No one reacted with urgency to help him. That realization cut deeper than the arrest itself. Joseph waited for messages that never came. For lawyers sent by intermediaries. For reassurances whispered through channels he had relied on for years. None arrived. The silence that had begun after the killing now thickened into something suffocating. He was not just isolated physically. He was being erased socially. In the days that followed, the questions began. Not shouted accusations, but slow, careful probes. Investigators spoke in measured tones, offering water, cigarettes, pauses. They did not rush. They knew something Joseph did not want to admit to himself. Tom was on their side. At first, he said nothing. Silence had always been his shield. He had survived earlier arrests that way. Let them talk. Let them speculate. Let them build cases that collapsed under their own weight. This was familiar territory. But something was wrong. The questions were too specific, too informed. Names were mentioned casually. Dates aligned too neatly. Events he believed were buried resurfaced with alarming clarity. Someone had been talking, or many someones. The realization landed heavily in his chest. Joseph began replaying the last months in his mind, searching for the breach. who had drifted away too quickly, who had avoided his eyes, who had survived when they shouldn't have. Paranoia filled the gaps memory could not. The nights were the worst. The cell grew colder after midnight. Sounds echoed differently. Every cough from another inmate sounded like movement. Every guard's footsteps felt like a countdown. Joseph slept in fragments, waking repeatedly with his heart racing, convinced someone was standing just beyond his vision. He thought about Winter Hill, about the Mafia, about how quickly they had withdrawn, how cleanly. He understood the logic now. He had become expendable. More than that, he had become useful to the system as an example, or worse, as a sacrifice. That understanding twisted something inside him. For the first time in his life, Joseph felt something close to abandonment. Not betrayal. Betrayal implies expectation. This was colder. A realization that he had never truly belonged anywhere. He had been used, feared, tolerated, never protected. That truth stripped away the last illusion he had carried. He began to imagine what awaited him if he stayed silent. Long sentences, violent prisons, enemies with nothing left to lose. Men who blamed him for their own exposure. Men who believed killing him would restore balance. Silence no longer looked like strength. It looked like a slow execution. Investigators sensed a shift. They didn't push. They waited. They spoke less, not more. They allowed him to sit with his thoughts. That was the real interrogation. Joseph began asking questions of his own, carefully framed, cautiously delivered. Hypotheticals, clarifications, what-ifs. The responses were non-committal, but they carried possibility. Possibility was dangerous. It crept in where fear had always lived. He resisted it at first. He told himself cooperation was weakness. That talking meant death. That informants did not survive. Those beliefs had been drilled into him long before he ever met organized crime. They were as fundamental as breathing. But breathing was getting harder. Each day, without outside support, reinforced the same message. No one was coming. No lawyer appeared with reassurance. No bail deal materialized. The silence from the underworld was complete. They had already moved on. Joseph's anger flared, then burned out. Rage requires direction. He had none. What remained was calculation. Cold, methodical, relentless. He had always been good at assessing threats. Now he turned that skill inward. What leverage did he have? He thought about everything he had seen. Not formal structures or hierarchies, but patterns. Meetings. Habits. Who spoke to whom? Who avoided whom? Which faces appeared together too often? Which names surfaced repeatedly in quiet conversations? He realized, slowly, with growing unease, that he knew more than he had ever acknowledged. He had never cared before. Knowledge had never felt necessary. Violence solved things faster. Now violence was useless. Information was the only currency left. That realization terrified him more than any gun ever had. Because information cuts both ways. If he used it, he would become something else entirely. Not just a killer, not just a problem, but a traitor. A label that follows you into every room, every cell, every future. Joseph wrestled with the idea in silence. He did not sleep. He paced. He sat. He stared. He remembered faces of men who would kill him without hesitation if given the chance. Men he had once believed feared him. Men who now feared what he might say. Fear shifted shape. It was no longer fear of being killed. It was fear of choosing the wrong way to survive. The investigators returned. This time, they spoke plainly. Not threatening. Not pleading. Just stating realities. Charges. Sentences. Possibilities. The math was brutal. Silence equaled decades. Cooperation equaled uncertainty. But uncertainty carried hope. Hope was a dangerous thing for a man like Joseph Barboza. He asked for time. Time was granted. Alone again, Joseph leaned back against the cold wall and closed his eyes. He pictured his future as two corridors. One long and narrow, ending in darkness. The other branching, unpredictable, lit by flickering, unreliable light. Neither promised safety, but one offered movement. Joseph had always chosen movement. By the time the guards returned to escort him back for questioning, Something inside him had shifted permanently. The violence that had defined his life had finally reached its limit. Not because he had grown tired of it, but because it had failed. The arrest had done more than restrain his body. It had isolated his mind. And in that isolation, Joseph Barboza made the most dangerous decision of his life. Not to fight, not to flee, but to talk. The consequences of that choice would ripple far beyond the walls of that cell. And soon, everyone who had ever relied on his silence would learn just how loud it could be. Chapter 8. The Deal with the Devil. The room where the decision was made did not feel important. No dramatic lighting, no imposing table, just pale walls, a metal desk scarred by years of elbows and paperwork, and the faint smell of old coffee that never quite left the building. Joseph Barboza sat alone for a long time before anyone came in. He preferred it that way. Silence gave him space to think, and thinking now was the only weapon he had left. When the door finally opened, it did so without ceremony. Two men entered, calm, unhurried, carrying folders thick with paper and patience. They did not look at him like predators. They looked at him like accountants, already tallying costs and benefits. That unnerved him more than anger ever could. They did not begin with threats. They did not need to. The threats were already sitting in the room with him. They began with facts, dates, places, names spoken casually, almost conversationally. Each one landed like a quiet confirmation of something Joseph had already feared. The walls were closing in, not violently, methodically. He listened without interruption, his face still, his breathing measured. Inside, his mind raced. He recognized the strategy immediately. They were showing him that silence no longer protected him, that the story of his life, the one he believed only he truly knew, was already being written without his input. When they paused, waiting for a response, Joseph said nothing. He had survived too many confrontations by speaking too soon. Words, once released, could not be taken back. He needed to understand the full shape of the trap before deciding whether to step into it. They shifted tactics gently. They spoke about consequences, about sentences that stretched longer than memory, about prisons where reputations followed you like shadows. They did not exaggerate. Exaggeration insults intelligence. They spoke plainly, which made it worse. Joseph felt his pulse quicken despite his efforts to remain composed. He had always believed he could endure anything if he stayed silent. But silence now felt like choosing a slow, deliberate erasure, not just of his freedom, but of his existence. Then they offered something different. Not freedom, not absolution, but possibility. The word hovered in the air between them, dangerous and intoxicating. Possibility meant survival. It also meant betrayal. The two were inseparable. Joseph understood that instantly. They did not ask him to confess. They did not demand names outright. They framed it as cooperation, as assistance, as a way to help the system understand a world it struggled to penetrate. They spoke about dismantling violence, about preventing future bloodshed. Joseph almost laughed. He had lived long enough to know how little the system cared about prevention. This was about leverage. They knew he had it. They knew he was running out of time. They were offering him a way to trade one for the other. Joseph asked a single question, his voice low and controlled. What happens to me if I talk? The answer was careful, non-committal, honest in its own way. There were no guarantees. Protection could be arranged, relocation, new identity, but nothing was permanent. The danger would never fully disappear. He appreciated that honesty. Lies would have ended the conversation immediately. The men left him alone again. Joseph leaned back in a chair and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the world he came from, about the rules he had learned early and lived by ruthlessly. You do not talk. You do not betray. You do not survive by trusting outsiders. Those rules had kept him alive longer than most men like him. They had also brought him here. He thought about Winter Hill, about the Mafia, about how quickly they had cut him loose. No warning, no negotiation, no loyalty extended when he needed it most. The rules, he realized, had always been one-sided. Loyalty flowed upward. Sacrifice flowed downward. That realization hardened into resolve. Joseph was not betraying a family. He was acknowledging a transaction that had already ended. They had used him. He had served his purpose. Now he was being discarded. Survival required adaptation. He had always adapted. When the door opened again, Joseph did not hesitate. He began carefully, not with the biggest names, not with the most explosive details. He started with structure, with patterns, with how things worked rather than who ordered them. He spoke about the flow of money, the way violence was sanctioned, the unspoken agreements that govern interactions between groups. The investigators listened without interruption. They took notes, but sparingly. This was not a performance. It was an excavation. As Joseph spoke, something strange happened. The tension that had knotted inside him for months began to loosen. Not because he felt relief, but because the waiting was over. Action, even dangerous action, felt familiar. He was moving again. He watched their reactions closely, not for approval, but for signs of disbelief. He found none. That emboldened him. He went deeper. Names emerged slowly, reluctantly. Not shouted, not dumped. Offered one at a time, weighed carefully before release. Each name felt like a door closing behind him. He did not rush. He understood the value of pacing. Information, like violence, had impact only when delivered correctly. With each disclosure, the balance of power in the room shifted. Joseph could feel it. The men across from him were no longer leading the conversation. They were responding to it, adjusting, asking follow-up questions that betrayed surprise. They had expected cooperation. They had not expected depth. Joseph realized then just how much he knew. Not because he had sought knowledge, but because his life had placed him at intersections others avoided. He had been present when men spoke freely, assuming fear equaled silence. He had watched habits form. He had noticed patterns others ignored. This was his true leverage. The deal evolved quickly after that. Lawyers entered the conversation. Paperwork appeared. Agreements drafted and revised. Immunity discussed in narrow terms. Conditions clarified. Joseph listened carefully, questioning details most men would have missed. He was not trusting them. He was negotiating. He insisted on protections, on distance, on assurances that went beyond words. He understood they could not promise safety, but he wanted commitment, evidence that this was not another transaction where he would be used and abandoned. They agreed to more than they wanted to, not because they trusted him, but because what he offered was unprecedented, a window into a world that had resisted scrutiny for decades. Joseph Barboza was not just an informant. He was a breach. Word of his cooperation did not spread immediately. These things never do. But pressure shifted subtly. Cases accelerated. Investigations expanded. Old files resurfaced. People began to feel watched in ways they hadn't before. Joseph felt it too. The moment he committed fully, the weight of his decision settled in. There was no turning back. No partial cooperation. Half measures would get him killed faster than silence ever could. If he was going to talk, he would have to talk completely. That realization frightened him more than any threat from the street. He began to imagine faces. Men he had worked with. Men he had intimidated. Men he had protected and threatened in equal measure. He knew what they would do if they discovered what he had become. He also knew that discovery was inevitable. The deal with the devil was never meant to be secret. It was meant to be decisive. As days turned into weeks, Joseph's role expanded. He was moved, guarded, isolated, interrogated for hours at a time. He repeated stories, clarified details, corrected timelines. The process was exhausting, but exhaustion was preferable to waiting for death. The investigators began to understand the scale of what they had unlocked. This was not just about murders. It was about corruption, about protection, about the machinery that allowed violence to operate with minimal consequence. Joseph was mapping a system from the inside out. He did not soften his role. He did not seek redemption. When asked about his own actions, he did not minimize them. He described them plainly, almost clinically. Guilt never entered the room. Responsibility did. That distinction mattered. Some of the men listening to him were disturbed. Others were energized. A few were visibly conflicted. Building cases on the testimony of a confessed killer came with moral cost. But ambition has a way of dulling discomfort. They justified it the same way everyone else always had. The ends mattered more than the means. Joseph understood that logic intimately. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his life as a weapon wielded by others. Now he was being wielded by the state. Different hands, same purpose. Protection measures intensified. Relocation plans were discussed. New identities drafted. Joseph listened, but he did not fully believe in them. He knew how fragile systems were, how often promises failed under pressure. He trusted only one thing, that he had become too valuable to discard. For now, as the chapter closed, Joseph Barboza sat alone again, this time in a different room, under different lights, guarded by different men. He felt no triumph, no relief, only a deep, grinding awareness that his life had entered its most dangerous phase. He had survived violence. He had survived abandonment. Now he would have to survive truth. And truth, once released, does not care who it destroys along the way. Chapter 9, Telling Everything. The first name left Joseph Barboza's mouth without drama. No pause, no trembling confession, just a statement delivered in the same flat, controlled tone he had used his entire life when explaining how something worked. The men in the room noticed immediately. This was not a man easing himself into cooperation. This was a man opening a door he knew would never close. Once the first name was spoken, the room changed. The air felt heavier, as if everyone understood they had crossed from theory into consequence. Joseph felt it too. Not guilt, not fear, momentum. He had spent his life learning when to strike and when to wait. This was no different. Information, like violence, needed rhythm. Dumping everything at once would dull its impact and reduce its value. He spoke deliberately, building a structure piece by piece, letting the investigators see the outline before filling it in. He explained how meetings happened without ever being scheduled, how men arrived separately and left without acknowledging one another, how power flowed not through titles, but through silence and habit. He described the way decisions were implied rather than stated, the way refusal was expressed through absence instead of argument. As he talked, the investigators stopped interrupting. They stopped steering. They let him lead. Joseph noticed that shift and adjusted accordingly. He slowed his pace, clarified details before being asked, corrected assumptions gently, almost patiently. He was no longer defending himself. He was teaching. Names followed patterns, not randomly, but geographically, relationally. Joseph understood that naming one man without explaining the context made the information brittle. So he built bridges between names, showing how one relationship fed into another, how favors created obligations, how obligations turned into silence. He talked about murders the way a mechanic talks about accidents, not to excuse them, but to explain how they happened. Who made the decision? Who benefited? Who stayed quiet afterward? He did not soften his role. When asked directly, he acknowledged his actions without embellishment. The lack of defensiveness unsettled some in the room. They expected denial, or justification, or bargaining. Instead, they got clarity. As the sessions continued, Joseph's reputation transformed. On the street, he had been known as a blunt instrument, unpredictable and brutal. In these rooms, he revealed something else entirely, a memory sharpened by vigilance, an attention to detail honed by survival. He remembered dates, sequences, locations with unnerving precision. He remembered because forgetting had always been dangerous. The investigators cross-checked his statements constantly. They left the room and returned with documents, reports, old witness statements. Each time, Joseph adjusted only where memory failed him. More often than not, the records confirmed his account. That confirmation amplified the weight of his words. He began to understand how deeply his cooperation was cutting. Cases long considered unsolvable started shifting. Old suspects resurfaced. Investigations reopened. Men who believed themselves insulated by time felt pressure again, the kind that seeps into routines and erodes confidence. Joseph felt a strange detachment as he watched it unfold. These were men he had once feared, men he had once served, men who had decided he was expendable. Now they were reacting to him. That reversal did not bring satisfaction. It brought focus. He knew exactly what this made him. Not a witness, not a victim, a tool, a living document, something to be used until it wore out. He accepted that role without complaint. Complaints implied expectation. He had none. There were moments when the weight of what he was doing pressed in unexpectedly. Not remorse, but recognition. He saw how his words reached outward, touching lives he would never meet. Families, businesses, neighborhoods. He did not dwell on it. Dwelling would slow him down. But the investigators did. Some asked him whether he felt responsible for the consequences. He answered honestly. Responsibility had never guided his choices. Survival had. That answer did not satisfy them, but clarified something they had been circling for weeks. Joseph Barboza was not cooperating to make things right. He was cooperating to stay alive. The testimony expanded beyond individual crimes. Joseph began outlining systems. How law enforcement pressure was anticipated and deflected. How informants were identified and neutralized. How violence was used not just to punish, but to communicate boundaries. He spoke about corruption carefully, aware of the line he was walking. He named practices before naming people. That strategy frustrated some prosecutors. They wanted headlines. He wanted protection. Eventually, they realized he was right. Information without context was explosive. Information with structure was devastating. Protection measures intensified as the scope of his cooperation became clear. Guards changed. Locations shifted. Routines were altered without explanation. Joseph noticed everything. He said nothing. He trusted no one completely, but he trusted the process enough to continue. Stopping now would be fatal. He understood that better than anyone. Word leaked, despite efforts to contain it. It always does. Rumors reached the street. A killer had flipped. A man who knew too much was talking. Panic spread unevenly. Some fled. Some lawyered up. Some doubled down on silence. Joseph imagined their reactions without pleasure. He knew the calculations happening in their minds because he had made them himself countless times. Who might talk? Who might be blamed? Who might be sacrificed to draw attention away? He wondered briefly if someone would try to kill him before it was too late. The thought did not frighten him. It focused him. He accelerated his cooperation after that, understanding the narrowing window. The more he gave, the more indispensable he became. Indispensability was the closest thing to safety he could achieve. Courtrooms loomed ahead, though they felt abstract for now. Joseph understood that his voice would eventually carry into places far more public than these closed rooms. That visibility terrified him more than prison ever had. Exposure stripped away control. He prepared for it by rehearsing his statements repeatedly, not to perfect them, but to make them automatic. Under pressure, instinct takes over. He wanted his instincts aligned with survival. The investigators debated among themselves. They questioned the ethics of building cases on the testimony of a man responsible for so much violence. They weighed public perception against legal necessity. Joseph observed these debates with detached amusement. Morality, he knew, was flexible under pressure. He was proof of that. As weeks turned into months, Joseph's isolation deepened. He lived under constant supervision, yet profoundly alone. No visitors, no familiar faces, just handlers, guards, and questions. He filled the silence with recollection, replaying his life not to judge it, but to mine it. Memory became labor. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that his cooperation would reshape the landscape he came from. Not immediately, not cleanly, but irreversibly. That realization settled over him like a long shadow. He did not know whether history would remember him as a monster, a traitor, or a necessary evil. He suspected it would remember him as all three. Late one night, alone in a guarded room, Joseph stared at his reflection in a darkened window. For the first time, he allowed himself a question he had avoided for decades. What happens when there is nothing left to trade? The answer did not come easily. He had given names. He had given structure. He had given truth stripped of sentiment. Eventually, the well would run dry. And when it did, his value would change. That thought followed him into uneasy sleep. Because telling everything does not end danger. It simply changes its direction. And Joseph Barboza had just turned the world. He came from inside out. There would be no forgiveness. Only consequences. Chapter 10. The most dangerous witness alive. By the time Joseph Barboza was moved again, he understood what he had become. Not a man. Not a criminal. Not even an informant in the traditional sense. He was an object of gravity. Wherever he existed, pressure bent toward him. Investigations accelerated. Careers aligned themselves around his testimony. Old alliances fractured under the sheer weight of what he knew. His presence distorted the environment, and everyone in authority could feel it. That realization came quietly. During a drive he wasn't told the destination of. The windows were tinted. The guard spoke only when necessary. Routes changed mid-journey. At one point, the car stopped unexpectedly, and Joseph's hand drifted instinctively toward a weapon that was no longer there. He caught himself and almost smiled. Old habits die hard, even when the context has changed completely. The place they brought him to felt temporary by design. Neutral walls, sparse furniture, no windows that revealed anything useful. This was not protection meant to last. It was protection meant to hold. Joseph sensed that immediately. Inside the system, debates intensified. Prosecutors saw him as a cornerstone. Defense attorneys saw him as a vulnerability. Law enforcement saw him as both a prize and a liability. He was indispensable, but also radioactive. Every decision involving him carried risk. If he lived, cases advanced. If he died, the fallout would be catastrophic. That duality defined his existence now. He was briefed on the scope of what his testimony was triggering. Not in full detail, but enough to understand the magnitude. Arrests pending. Warrants issued. Grand jury proceedings expanding. The machinery of the state was turning, and Joseph Barboza was the spark in its engine. He listened without reaction. This was no longer surprising. He had felt the acceleration for weeks. What surprised him was how little satisfaction it brought. Power, he realized, only feels powerful when it's voluntary. This was obligation. This was momentum he could not control. Protection protocols grew more intense. Guards rotated unpredictably. Communication was restricted. Schedules changed daily. He was instructed not to linger near doors or windows, not to establish routines, not to speak casually with anyone outside designated handlers. Every instruction reinforced the same truth. Someone was going to try to kill him. Joseph accepted that as fact, not fear. Fear implies uncertainty. This was certainty waiting for opportunity. He began to imagine scenarios, not obsessively, but professionally. Snipers, poison, staged accidents, friendly faces concealing intent. He knew the playbook intimately because he had once been the one executing parts of it. That knowledge did not comfort him. It sharpened him. The irony was suffocating. He had built his reputation on being untouchable through fear. Now fear surrounded him, but it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to everyone else. Court preparations began in earnest. Joseph was coached on procedure, on pacing, on how to answer without embellishment. Lawyers explained the importance of consistency, of calm delivery, of allowing silence to do some of the work. Joseph absorbed it all quickly. This was another system to master, another environment where mistakes had consequences. He rehearsed his testimony alone, replaying names and sequences in his head until they felt mechanical. Emotion was a liability. He stripped it away. What remained was narrative. Facts arranged deliberately, like steps across a minefield. The first time he entered a courtroom under heavy guard, the atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations dropped. Eyes followed him. He felt the collective intake of breath, the unspoken recognition rippling outward. This was not just a witness. This was a man who had detonated something vast and uncontrollable. He sat, hands folded, posture composed, and waited. The questions came slowly at first, designed to establish credibility. Background. History. Associations. Joseph answered plainly, without flourish. He did not dramatize his past. He did not soften it either. When asked about violence, he acknowledged it as fact, not performance. That restraint unsettled the room more than outrage ever could. As proceedings continued, his name began appearing in newspapers. Not always accurately, not always fairly. He was labeled a monster, a turncoat, a necessary evil. Each headline simplified a story too complex for sound bites. Joseph read none of them. He did not need external commentary to understand his position. Inside the underworld, panic intensified. Men who had built careers on invisibility suddenly felt exposed. Old grudges resurfaced as blame sought targets. Some believed Joseph was exaggerating. Others knew better. They remembered his silence, his presence, his attention to detail. They understood exactly how much damage he could do. Conversations shifted from denial to mitigation, from loyalty to survival. Joseph imagined those conversations with detached clarity. He knew the calculus. Who would be sacrificed to draw focus away? Who would disappear? Who would gamble on eliminating him before it was too late? He had made those same calculations once in another life. Protection tightened again. He was moved between locations without notice, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes during mundane routines designed to lull complacency. He slept in fragments, alert to every sound, every change in rhythm. The guards noticed his vigilance and respected it. He was not afraid. He was prepared. The strain accumulated nonetheless. Not physically, but psychologically. Living as the axis of so much tension warps perception. Joseph began to feel like time itself bent around him, stretching and compressing unpredictably. Days blurred. Weeks vanished. Only moments of acute focus stood out. There were attempts, not successful ones, not even close, but indicators. A car following too long. A routine breached and corrected immediately. A guard reassigned without explanation. Joseph recognized the signs. The net was tightening on both sides. He was informed, carefully, that there were credible threats, that plans had been discussed, that resources were being allocated to neutralize them. Joseph listened, nodded, and asked practical questions. How? When? Where? What contingencies existed? He did not ask why. He already knew. The courtroom appearances intensified. Each one drained him in ways violence never had. Speaking under oath carried a different weight. Words echoed. They did not vanish into fear. They stayed. Recorded. Transcribed. Replayed. He felt the permanence of it pressing in. He wondered, briefly, whether any version of his life could have ended differently. The thought passed quickly. Regret had no utility. What mattered now was endurance. Prosecutors leaned on him heavily. Defense attorneys attacked his credibility relentlessly. They painted him as unstable, self-serving, irredeemable. Joseph absorbed it without reaction. None of it was new. He had been all those things. The truth of that did not negate the truth of what he was saying. The juries noticed. There is a particular stillness that settles over a room when people sense they are hearing something irreversible. Joseph felt it during his testimony. The subtle shift, as listeners realized this was not rumor or speculation. This was an insider dismantling a system from within. That made him the most dangerous witness alive. Not because of what he had done in the past, but because of what he was doing now. Every night, under guard, Joseph lay awake and considered the future. Not optimistically, not pessimistically, realistically. He understood that survival was not guaranteed. Protection could fail. Attention could wane. Interest could shift. When his usefulness ended, his value would change again. He accepted that as the final constant of his life. Violence had once been his language. Silence had been his shield. Now truth was his currency, and like all currency, it depreciated with use. He needed to spend it wisely, but he also knew hoarding it would be fatal. As this chapter closed, Joseph Barboza existed in a state few ever experience. Feared by criminals, debated by officials, watched by everyone, alive not because he was loved or protected, but because the consequences of his death were still too great. For now, he had become something the underworld never forgives and the system never fully trusts. A man too dangerous to release and too valuable to kill. The balance would not hold forever. Chapter 11. Living under a death sentence. By the time Joseph Barboza realized that survival itself had become a sentence, the illusion of safety was already gone. Protection no longer felt like shelter. It felt like containment. Every locked door, every armed escort, every carefully planned movement reminded him that his life was now something managed by others, measured in risk assessments and contingency plans. He was alive but not free, and he understood, with grim clarity, that this arrangement had no natural ending. The days began to blur together in a way that unsettled him more than chaos ever had. In his old life, time had shape, jobs had rhythm, violence created before and after moments that anchored memory. Now, time stretched thin and colorless. Mornings arrived without purpose. Nights ended without rest. The only markers were briefings, relocations, and a low murmur of guards communicating in clipped phrases just out of his hearing. He lived with the constant awareness that someone, somewhere, was planning his death. Not hypothetically, not emotionally, practically. Joseph did not dramatize that fact. He cataloged it. Who would want him dead? Who would benefit? Who might be willing to risk retaliation to make it happen? The list was long, fluid, and growing. Every arrest tied to his testimony added another name. Every conviction tightened the pressure. He had detonated something that could not be contained quietly. The state tried to reassure him. New identities were discussed again, more seriously this time. Places far from Boston, far from the Northeast, far from anyone who had ever known him. The idea sounded clean on paper. In practice, it felt hollow. Joseph understood the reach of the underworld too well to believe in total disappearance. Faces change. Names change. Habits do not. And habits get people killed. He was warned repeatedly not to establish routines, not to linger, not to speak casually, not to trust familiarity. These warnings would have sounded excessive to someone else. To Joseph, they felt obvious. He had spent his life exploiting routines. He knew how fragile they were. Even so, the monotony wore him down. He slept lightly, if at all. When sleep came, it was shallow and easily broken. Dreams were fragmented and disjointed. Not flashbacks, not guilt-driven visions, but sensations. The sound of footsteps behind him. The weight of a gaze he couldn't locate. The sense of being moments away from something final. He woke each time already alert, already scanning. The guards noticed. They always did. Some treated him with professional detachment, others with thinly veiled discomfort. A few with something approaching respect. They knew who he was. They knew what he had done. And they knew that standing between him and the world made them potential collateral. Joseph did not seek conversation. He did not seek sympathy. He conserved energy. Every interaction felt like exposure. Even benign words could become patterns. Patterns became vulnerabilities. Court proceedings continued, stretching on longer than he expected. The legal system moved with deliberate slowness, weighing every motion, every appeal. Defense strategies evolved. Witnesses were challenged. Narratives were contested. Joseph's credibility was attacked relentlessly. He endured it with practiced detachment. Being called a liar, a monster, a manipulator, none of it stung. Those words had followed him his entire life. What unsettled him was the subtle shift in tone over time. The attacks became less about discrediting his testimony and more about shaping perception, preparing the ground for the moment when he might no longer be needed. Joseph noticed everything. He noticed when prosecutors stopped asking new questions and began revisiting old ones. He noticed when briefings grew shorter, when updates became less frequent, when the urgency around his protection softened just slightly. These were not overt changes. They were bureaucratic, procedural, the kind of shifts that signal a transition approaching. He understood what that meant. Value is never permanent. The violence he had unleashed through truth continued rippling outward. More arrests, More deals. More names surfacing. Each development brought temporary reassurance. He was still useful. Still central. Still alive because he mattered. But usefulness decays. Joseph spent long hours alone thinking about endings. Not melodramatically. Practically. He had always believed death would come suddenly, violently, without warning. Now he saw another possibility. A slow narrowing. Protection thinning. Attention shifting. An eventual handoff to a quieter existence where mistakes would be fatal. The idea of living out his days under constant threat did not frighten him. The idea of being forgotten did. There were moments, rare but sharp, when he considered whether he had chosen correctly, whether silence, prison, and eventual death behind bars would have been simpler. At least that path had structure. This one felt unbounded, precarious. But regret requires imagining alternatives that could have existed. Joseph did not believe in alternatives. He had acted according to the logic that had always governed his life. Survival first. Loyalty only when reciprocated. Adaptation over sentiment. That logic had carried him here. It would carry him wherever this ended. Threat assessments intensified again after credible intelligence surfaced about potential retaliation. Details were vague, but urgency returned. Movements became more restricted. Escorts doubled. Routes changed mid-journey. Joseph recognized the signs of imminent danger. Someone had tried to move. The attempt failed before it materialized fully, neutralized quietly, through channels Joseph would never be told about. That secrecy bothered him more than the threat itself. He understood that not knowing was part of the arrangement. Information flowed one way now. He provided it. He did not receive it. That imbalance gnawed at him. He began to feel like an artifact. Something kept secure until it could be archived or destroyed. The system that had embraced him for his utility was slowly distancing itself emotionally, professionally. He sensed the coming shift long before anyone acknowledged it. During one late-night relocation, as the car moved through empty streets under heavy guard, Joseph caught his reflection in the darkened window. The face staring back felt unfamiliar. Older, leaner, harder in a different way. The animal, as the world had known him, was gone. In his place sat something quieter and more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose but time. He thought about the men who wanted him dead. Not with hatred, with understanding. He knew exactly what they felt. He had been in their position before, faced with a threat that could not be reasoned with. A presence that destabilized everything simply by existing. The irony was almost elegant. Joseph Barboza had become the very thing he once eliminated without hesitation. A liability. He wondered who would ultimately make the decision. A prosecutor balancing risk. A marshal reviewing budgets. A politician reading polling data. Decisions about life and death were rarely personal at that level. They were logistical. That thought hardened something inside him. If his death came, it would not be dramatic. It would be procedural. A lapse. A miscalculation. A moment when resources were reallocated elsewhere. He understood that deeply. Systems fail quietly. That knowledge did not drive him to despair. It sharpened his awareness. Joseph began paying closer attention to everything. Small changes in tone, shifts in guard behavior, variations in protocol. He memorized faces, not out of trust, but recognition. Recognition buys seconds. Seconds by survival. He spoke less, ate less, slept less. Conservation became instinct. In moments of rare honesty with himself, he acknowledged a truth he had avoided. No matter how this ended, he would never outrun what he had done. New names and new places could not erase memory. His own or others. Living under a death sentence was not about waiting to die. It was about understanding that every day lived was borrowed. As this chapter drew to a close, Joseph Barboza remained alive, guarded, and essential, but only just. The balance holding him in place grew more fragile with each passing week. The forces that had aligned to protect him were already preparing for a future where they no longer needed to. He could feel it. The air around him no longer bent inward. It was beginning to drift away. And Joseph knew better than anyone what happens when attention fades in a world built on violence. It does not forgive. It does not forget. It simply chooses its moment. Chapter 12. The Long Shadow of Betrayal. The danger did not announce itself with movement or noise. It arrived as a presence, heavy and constant, settling over Joseph Barboza's life like a second atmosphere. Betrayal, once committed, does not fade. It stretches. It follows. It adapts. And Joseph understood, with painful clarity, that the moment he chose to speak, he had cast a shadow longer than anything violence had ever created. He felt it in the way rooms seemed to shrink when he entered them, even under government protection. In the way conversations lowered instinctively. In the way eyes lingered just a fraction too long before looking away. Even among those tasked with keeping him alive, there was distance. Professional, measured, but unmistakable. Betrayal has a gravity that pulls everything inward, including trust. The system continued to move him from place to place, each relocation framed as precaution, each new address meant to erase the last. But erasure was an illusion. Joseph carried himself the same way everywhere. His posture, his vigilance, his silence. You could rename him, relocate him, dress him differently, but the essence remained. And essence is what killers look for. He knew that somewhere, men were still thinking about him. Not constantly, not emotionally, but deliberately. He imagined them the way he once imagined targets. Patient, methodical, waiting for opportunity, not rushing toward it. That knowledge followed him into every quiet moment. The trials tied to his testimony continued unfolding, their consequences rippling outward into neighborhoods and families Joseph would never see. Convictions landed like distant thunder, some loud, some barely noticed by the public, but each one tightened the knot around his existence. Each verdict confirmed what the underworld already believed. He had not just talked, he had dismantled. That made forgiveness impossible. Joseph did not delude himself into thinking anyone would understand his choice. Not the men he had betrayed, not the families of those imprisoned or killed, not even the system that now relied on him. He was useful, not sympathetic, necessary, not redeemable. That realization did not trouble him the way it might have troubled someone else. Sympathy had never protected him. Understanding had never saved him. Only awareness had. And awareness told him this could not last forever. There were moments when the protective routines slipped, not catastrophically, but enough to remind him how fragile the arrangement was. A guard late to a shift, a car that took too long to arrive, a miscommunication corrected quietly, without explanation. These were not failures. They were warnings. Systems are strong until they aren't. Joseph found himself thinking more often about inevitability. Not death itself, but convergence. All paths narrowing toward a single outcome, no matter how many detours were taken along the way. He had seen it countless times before from the opposite side. Men who believed they could outrun consequences, only to discover the road always circled back. The difference now was that he could see it coming. He spent long hours alone, not reminiscing, but reviewing, replaying conversations he had once half heard, remembering faces he had dismissed as irrelevant. He wondered which of them might still be alive, still free, still angry enough to wait. Betrayal does not expire. It only cools. The system tried to keep him occupied. Briefings, interviews, follow-up testimony, occasional check-ins framed as concern. He answered when required, spoke when asked, but he sensed the shift in tone. The urgency had dulled. The novelty of his cooperation had worn thin. New cases were being built without his input now. Others were talking. Others were filling gaps. That frightened him more than open hostility ever could. Being central keeps you alive. Being peripheral makes you expendable. Joseph began to sense that he was drifting toward the edge of relevance. Still protected, still guarded, but no longer the axis around which everything turned. The shadow of betrayal still loomed, but the spotlight had moved on. He adjusted instinctively, became quieter, less demanding, less visible. Visibility attracts attention. Attention invites action. He had learned that lesson early in life. Now he applied it to survival rather than dominance. Even so, there were nights when the weight of it all pressed too hard. Not guilt, not remorse, but exhaustion. A deep, cellular fatigue that seeped into his bones. Living every day as a calculation wears a man down. Constant vigilance leaves no room for rest. Sleep, when it came, brought no peace. Dreams were vague and impressionistic. Corridors stretching endlessly. Doors that opened onto other doors. Voices calling his name from just out of sight. He woke with his heart racing, scanning his surroundings automatically, body ready before his mind fully engaged. He began to wonder whether this existence was truly survival or simply delay. The system, for its part, seemed content to let time do the work. Witness protection plans were revisited, revised, postponed. New identities were proposed again, each one less convincing than the last. Joseph listened politely, asked practical questions, and said little. He understood that no plan could erase the past he carried. Betrayal, he realized, was not a single act. It was a condition, one that reshaped how the world responded to you forever. He thought often about loyalty, a concept he had never fully trusted. The underworld demanded it, but rarely returned it. The system invoked it selectively. In the end, loyalty had always been transactional. Joseph had simply acknowledged that reality sooner than most. Still, acknowledgement did not dull the consequences. Somewhere, the men he had exposed were adjusting to new realities. Some were behind bars, nursing grudges that had nowhere to go but inward. Others were free, nursing something worse. Patience. Joseph knew which group frightened him more. The passage of time did not soften his awareness. It sharpened it. Every day that passed without incident felt less like safety and more like prelude. He had lived long enough to recognize the pattern. Calm before convergence. Silence before action. He wondered, sometimes, whether his death would even make headlines when it came. Whether it would be framed as an accident, an illness, a quiet end that required no explanation. He suspected it would. The world prefers clean endings, even when they are lies. That thought did not anger him. It clarified him. If this was to be the shape of his life, then clarity was all he had left. He would not beg. He would not pretend. He would not delude himself with false hope. He would remain alert, aware, and prepared until the last possible moment. The long shadow of betrayal stretched across everything now. Across his past, his present, his imagined future. It followed him not because he regretted his choice, but because the world he came from never forgets those who break its rules. Joseph Barboza had broken them all. As this chapter closed, he remained alive, guarded, and increasingly alone. The machinery that once revolved around him continued to turn, but its center had shifted. He could feel it in the air, in the routines, in the subtle easing of urgency. The shadow had not lifted. It had simply grown quieter. And Joseph knew better than anyone what quiet often means. It means something is waiting. Chapter 13. Running from the Inevitable. By the time Joseph Barboza understood that time itself had turned against him, there was no drama left in the realization. No panic. No anger. Just a cold, mathematical certainty settling into place. He had survived violence, betrayal, exposure, and the slow erosion of relevance. What remained was not danger in bursts, but danger as a constant state. A low hum beneath every moment of his life. The system still called it protection, still moved him when it deemed necessary, still checked boxes and updated files. But Joseph felt the difference now. The urgency had drained away. He was no longer a fire that needed containing. He was an ember, still capable of burning, but no longer commanding attention. That shift terrified him more than any explicit threat ever had. He had lived his entire life in reaction to pressure. Pressure from home, from the streets, from gangs, from law enforcement. Pressure created structure. It told him where to push back, where to strike, where to move. Now, the pressure was thinning, dispersing into bureaucracy and distance. And Joseph knew that when pressure disappears, it creates space. Space for mistakes. Space for opportunity. Space for someone else to act. He felt it most acutely in the routines meant to keep him alive. Guards rotated less frequently. Movements felt less tightly choreographed. Decisions took longer. Requests were met with delays instead of immediate responses. None of it was negligent. It was procedural, the kind of shift that happens when a crisis becomes a case file. Joseph had seen this pattern before from the other side. He knew exactly what it meant. You were no longer the priority. He began pushing for distance, not from the threat, but from visibility. He requested relocation again, new environments, new surroundings, places far removed from the networks he had destroyed. The answers were polite but vague. Feasibility studies, budget constraints, risk assessments, the language of delay. Delay is deadly. Joseph began to move differently. He spoke less, drew less attention. He avoided unnecessary interactions, not out of fear, but discipline. If he could not control the system around him, he would control himself. He revisited every lesson he had ever learned about survival, stripping them down to essentials. Movement without pattern, awareness without paranoia, distance without isolation. It was a delicate balance, and he was out of practice. Violence had once simplified everything. Now restraint demanded constant effort. There were moments when he considered disappearing on his own terms, slipping out of the protective web and trusting his instincts instead of procedures. He dismissed the idea quickly. Running without leverage would only shorten the timeline. He understood that better than anyone. Still, the thought lingered. Joseph began sensing something else as well, a subtle shift in the air around him. Conversations that stopped just a fraction too late. Eyes that lingered too long. The feeling of being evaluated again, but not by the system, by someone else. He could not identify the source. That unsettled him. In his old life, threats announced themselves through patterns. This felt quieter, more patient, more deliberate. That was never a good sign. He tried to surface concerns through official channels, framed them carefully, avoided sounding alarmist. The responses were measured but non-committal. Nothing concrete, no confirmed intelligence, no immediate action required. Joseph recognized the subtext instantly. No one was worried enough to move. That realization hardened into resolve. If no one else was going to anticipate the threat, he would. He began watching faces again. Not just guards, but civilians, drivers, clerks, people whose routines intersected with his environment. He studied reflections, listened for anomalies, counted steps, counted seconds. The instincts he had buried resurfaced naturally, like muscle memory. The animal had not vanished. It had adapted. There were days when he almost felt calm, when nothing happened, when the absence of danger felt like reprieve. He distrusted those days the most. Calm had always preceded violence in his experience. It was the space attackers needed to prepare. Joseph understood preparation intimately. The irony followed him everywhere. He had once been the man others waited for, the one whose arrival changed outcomes. Now he was the one being waited on, the target whose removal would close chapters and restore equilibrium. Chapter 14, The End Comes Quietly. The moment did not announce itself with urgency. There was no sudden rush of danger, no spike of adrenaline, no instinctive certainty that this was the end. It arrived the way Joseph Barboza's life had increasingly been unfolding, quietly, methodically, stripped of drama. That, more than anything else, should have warned him. He had learned long ago that violence rarely begins with noise. Noise comes after. The true danger moves softly, disguised as routine, camouflaged by familiarity. And by the time Joseph recognized the shape of what was happening, recognition itself no longer mattered. The days leading up to it felt ordinary in a way that unsettled him. Movements happened on schedule. Guards rotated without incident. No sudden briefings. No last-minute relocations. The air lacked tension, and that absence gnawed at him more than fear ever had. He had lived too long inside crisis to trust calm. Joseph told himself to stay alert, to watch for deviations, to listen for hesitation, to feel for imbalance. But the problem with inevitability is that it does not always arrive wearing warning signs. Sometimes it wears normalcy like a mask. He woke that morning the same way he had woken every morning for years. Instantly awake, already scanning, senses sharp before thought fully formed. The room was still, the light unchanged. Nothing felt wrong. That was the first sign. He moved through the hours with measured discipline, conserving energy, observing everything without appearing to observe anything at all. He spoke little, ate mechanically, drank coffee that tasted faintly burned. He noticed small things most people would ignore. The cadence of footsteps in the hallway. The way a door closed a second too slowly. The subtle shift in tone when someone spoke his name. None of it rose to the level of alarm. But taken together, it formed a pattern he recognized too well. Familiarity. Someone, somewhere, had grown comfortable. Comfort breeds shortcuts. Shortcuts create opportunity. Joseph felt the edge of something approaching, not as threat, but as alignment. Pieces he could not see were sliding into place. That sensation had always preceded violence in his life. Not panic, not anger. Alignment. He had no one to warn. No authority he trusted enough to escalate concerns. The system around him functioned on verification, not instinct. An instinct, in Joseph's experience, was rarely taken seriously until it was too late. He spent that afternoon thinking about endings. Not sentimentally, not regretfully, but structurally. How stories conclude. How men like him are removed. He knew better than anyone that the most effective endings leave no questions. No spectacle. No mess that requires explanation. Just silence. He thought briefly about running. The idea surfaced instinctively, then faded. Running would require chaos. Chaos would attract attention. Attention would accelerate everything. He was already too far along the timeline for that. Joseph understood something now that he hadn't before. The system that once protected him no longer feared losing him. And the world he had betrayed no longer feared waiting. That balance had tipped. Late in the day, he was told of a minor adjustment. A logistical change. Nothing dramatic. A routine shift, framed as precaution. The language was casual, reassuring. He nodded, outwardly calm, inwardly focused. This was it. The end does not come with certainty. It comes with recognition. And Joseph recognized it. The place they brought him to felt transitional, not permanent, not temporary. A space meant to be passed through, not occupied. He noted the layout automatically. Distances, angles, exits. His mind still worked the way it always had, even though his options no longer did. He did not feel fear. Fear requires hope of escape. What he felt instead was clarity. He thought often about equilibrium, about how organized crime functions less like chaos and more like an ecosystem. Remove one predator and another fills the space. Eliminate one disruption and balance returns. Joseph had disrupted everything. That disruption could not be allowed to persist indefinitely. He felt the noose tightening not through force, but through neglect. Resources redirected. Attention diverted. His continued existence becoming an inconvenience rather than an asset. The system had extracted what it needed from him. What remained was risk. Joseph began preparing internally for the endgame. Not dramatically. Practically. He adjusted his expectations. He accepted the probability that this would not end quietly or comfortably. Acceptance brought clarity. Clarity brought focus. He did not write letters. He did not make peace. He had never believed in closure. Instead, he refined awareness to its sharpest point. If death was coming, he intended to recognize it when it arrived. That recognition, he believed, would matter. He thought about all the ways this could end. A sudden strike, a staged accident, a betrayal from someone close enough to gain access. The last option felt most likely. Violence prefers proximity. Trust is always the most efficient weapon. Joseph cataloged everyone who had access to him. Not many, but enough. He did not know that decisions were already being made elsewhere. Quietly, efficiently. The kind of decisions that do not require consensus once the calculus becomes clear. Joseph Barboza was alive. He was dangerous. He was no longer essential. That equation does not remain unsolved for long. As weeks passed, the sense of inevitability deepened, not as dread, but as recognition. His life had always followed a trajectory defined by escalation. Violence led to power. Power led to exposure. Exposure led to collapse. This was simply the final stage. He wondered, briefly, whether history would understand him. The thought amused him. History rarely understands. It categorizes, simplifies, moves on. Monster, informant, footnote. None of those labels capture the truth. The truth was Messier, a man shaped by violence who learned too late that survival has limits. A man who spoke not out of conscience, but necessity. A man who outlived his usefulness. On one particular night, lying awake in a quiet room under dim light, Joseph felt something settle inside him. A stillness that was not fear, not resignation, but readiness. He did not know what form the end would take, only that it was approaching. He listened to the building breathe around him. Pipes, footsteps, distant traffic, ordinary sounds, stripped of meaning. He knew how quickly ordinary becomes final. He closed his eyes, not asleep, but to focus. Every sense tuned, every instinct alert. If this was to be the last stretch, he would meet it awake. Joseph Barboza had never been granted peace. He did not expect it now. As this chapter drew to a close, the path ahead narrowed into something unavoidable. Protection thinned. Attention drifted. The world he had dismantled adjusted without him. He was still alive, but survival, he knew, was no longer the question. The question was timing, and someone, somewhere, was already counting the minutes. He thought about the boy he had been, the apartment in Somerville, the screaming, the silence that followed. How violence had become his language before he ever understood words. How the world had taught him early that pain was predictable, and predictability could be mastered. He thought about the man he became, the animal, the weapon, the liability, the informant, each identity layered over the last, never replacing it, only narrowing it. He thought about the choices he had made, not to justify them, but to acknowledge them. Survival had always been his guiding principle. He had followed it faithfully. That it led here felt less like irony and more like completion. The people around him moved with practiced ease. No one rushed. No one hesitated. That, too, told him everything he needed to know. This had been decided long before today. Joseph did not struggle. That fact would later confuse those who tried to understand him. They would expect resistance, desperation, some final assertion of dominance. But Joseph had never fought endings. He fought beginnings. Once something was set in motion beyond reversal, he conserved energy. He observed. He noticed how eyes avoided his. Not out of fear, but avoidance. He noticed how voices remained level. How procedures unfolded cleanly. There was no malice in the room, only resolution. That, more than hatred, signaled finality. The last moments were not dramatic. No speech, no confession, no appeal. Joseph had learned long ago that words rarely change outcomes. He had spoken more than enough in his life. Now, there was nothing left to say. What passed through his mind in those final seconds was not remorse, nor regret, nor even anger. It was understanding. Understanding that violence had shaped him, but it had not defined the entire world. Understanding that betrayal had saved him, but only temporarily. Understanding that systems adapt, and those who disrupt them are eventually neutralized. Joseph Barboza had disrupted everything, and now the system was correcting itself. The end came quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. Exactly the way men like Joseph ensure endings come when they are the ones delivering them. Afterward, the world adjusted almost immediately. Schedules resumed. Files were closed. Protection protocols were reassigned. The machinery moved on, relieved of a complication it no longer needed to manage. News of his death spread unevenly. Some heard and nodded. Some shrugged. Some felt relief. Others felt vindication. A few felt nothing at all. The underworld absorbed it the way it absorbs everything, without comment, without pause. Joseph Barboza became what he had always been destined to become. A conclusion. The man who had terrified neighborhoods, destabilized organizations, and dismantled long-standing criminal structures did not leave behind a legacy so much as a lesson. Fear is powerful, but it is temporary. Information is dangerous, but it is expendable. Survival can be extended, but not indefinitely. His story ended not with redemption or condemnation, but with inevitability. Those who had used him distanced themselves. Those who had feared him exhaled. Those who had hunted him stopped looking. The shadow he had cast receded slowly, leaving behind gaps that others would eventually fill. And yet, for those who understood the underworld, Joseph Barboza's end carried a deeper warning. There are men who are too violent to trust. There are men who know too much to keep alive. And there are moments when those two truths converge. Joseph Barboza lived at that intersection. And when the balance finally tipped, the end did not need to be loud. It only needed to happen. Chapter 15. What remains after the blood? After Joseph Barboza was gone, the world did not stop to mark the moment. It never does. There was no pause in the rhythm of the streets he once haunted, no silence heavy enough to signal that something fundamental had ended. Cars still moved through Boston neighborhoods at the same measured pace. Bars still opened and closed. Conversations continued, uninterrupted, folding his absence into the background noise of ordinary life. That was the first truth of his legacy. The world absorbs even its most violent disruptions with remarkable efficiency. In the days immediately following his death, reactions spread unevenly, like ripples breaking against different shorelines. Among law enforcement, the response was procedural. Files were updated, protection details reassigned, risk assessments recalculated. Joseph Barboza became a closed chapter in an ongoing process. His utility had ended. His risk had been resolved. The system moved forward without ceremony. Among prosecutors, there was something closer to exhaustion than triumph. Years of preparation, testimony, and moral compromise had culminated in convictions that would stand long after the witness who made them possible was gone. Some felt vindicated. Others felt uneasy. Building justice on the testimony of a confessed killer leaves residue. No verdict fully cleans it away. Among criminals, the response was colder. There was no mourning, no public acknowledgement, just a quiet recalibration. Names Joseph had spoken were now spoken cautiously, if at all. Power structures shifted subtly as men reassessed who remained, who had fallen, and who might still be vulnerable. The vacuum left by his disruption began filling almost immediately. That was the second truth of his legacy. Violence removes individuals, not systems. Joseph Barboza had once believed fear could hold territory indefinitely. That belief shaped his life and hastened his end. Fear commands attention, but it does not sustain order. Once the source of fear disappears, the structure reshapes itself, often stronger for having been tested. The underworld learned from him, even as it erased him. His name lingered for a time, passed quietly among those who understood what he represented. Not as a hero, not as a martyr, but as a caution, a reminder of what happens when violence escapes its intended boundaries, when a weapon forgets who is supposed to hold it. In that sense, Joseph's story did not end with his death. It continued as a reference point, an unspoken example used to justify restraint, caution, and hierarchy. His life became a negative space around which others defined their behavior. For the public, the story flattened quickly. Headlines condensed decades of complexity into a few blunt phrases. Killer, informant, betrayer, victim. Each label captured a fragment of truth while obscuring the whole. The nuance vanished, as nuance always does when stories pass into general memory. Joseph Barboza became easier to understand once he was reduced. But reduction hides the most important lessons. He was not born a criminal mastermind. He did not rise through ranks with ambition and strategy. He did not operate according to the mythology often attached to organized crime. He was shaped early by violence, neglect, and a world that taught him power arrived through pain. That shaping mattered. By the time organized crime intersected with his life, he was already formed, already broken in specific ways, already fluent in the language of harm. The Mafia did not create Joseph Barboza. It merely found a use for him. And when that use expired, it stepped aside. The system that later protected him did something similar, though with different language and justification. It extracted value, managed risk, calculated cost. When the equation shifted, it adjusted accordingly. Neither side operated on sentiment. Both operated on necessity. Joseph understood that, even if he never articulated it aloud, his choice to cooperate with law enforcement has often been framed as betrayal. That framing misses something essential. Betrayal implies loyalty that was once mutual. Joseph had been used long before he ever spoke. His cooperation was not a moral awakening. It was an adaptation. Survival had always been his guiding principle. He followed it consistently. When violence protected him, he used violence. When silence protected him, he stayed silent. When information became his only shield, he spoke. That consistency, more than any single act, defines him. It also explains why redemption never fit his story. Joseph Barboza did not seek forgiveness. He did not attempt to rewrite his past or soften his role in the suffering he caused. He spoke because speaking extended his life, not because it cleansed his conscience. That honesty unsettled people far more than false remorse ever could. The discomfort remains. There is no clean way to reconcile the outcomes his testimony produced with the man who delivered it. He helped dismantle criminal networks while embodying the violence those networks thrived on. He was both instrument and indictment, solution and symptom. That contradiction is the third truth of his legacy. Some problems can only be addressed by confronting what created them. Joseph Barboza's life forces an uncomfortable question. What happens when the only people capable of exposing a violent system are themselves violent? The justice achieved through his cooperation was real. So was the damage he inflicted along the way. Holding both truths simultaneously is difficult, but necessary. After his death, witness protection protocols quietly evolved. Risk assessments became more conservative. The dangers of relying too heavily on a single informant were studied and documented. Joseph's case became a reference in training rooms and closed-door briefings. Not as inspiration, as warning. His story influenced how law enforcement weighed the balance between protection and exposure, how prosecutors evaluated the moral cost of their strategies, how agencies prepare for the inevitable moment when a witness's value begins to decline. In that way, Joseph continued shaping outcomes even in absence. For those who lived in the neighborhoods touched by his violence, his death brought no closure. Closure is a luxury reserved for stories with clear moral arcs. The harm he caused did not disappear with him. Memories lingered. Trauma persisted. His name remained attached to moments people could not forget. There were no apologies to be issued, no reconciliation to be offered. The past stayed where it always stays, in people. Joseph himself likely would have understood that better than anyone. He never believed in clean endings, only in endings that happened. Looking back, his life reads less like a rise and fall and more like a straight line drawn from early violence to inevitable consequence. Each phase flowed logically into the next. Abuse to aggression, aggression to criminal utility, utility to excess, excess to exposure, exposure to elimination. Nothing about it was random. That inevitability is what gives his story its weight. Not a body count, not the courtroom drama, not the betrayal, but the sense that once set in motion, the trajectory rarely deviated. Joseph Barboza did not break the cycle he came from. He accelerated it, and in doing so, he revealed its mechanics. The final truth of his legacy is perhaps the hardest to accept. His life did not teach the world how to stop violence. It taught the world how violence consumes those who rely on it exclusively. Fear can elevate a man quickly, but it isolates him just as fast. Information can protect temporarily, but it does not erase history. Survival strategies have expiration dates. Joseph Barboza reached his. In the years after his death, New names replaced his in whispered conversations. New figures rose to fill spaces he had destabilized. The underworld adapted, as it always does. Law enforcement shifted focus, as it always does. The machinery continued turning. What remained was a story that refused to simplify. A man who was neither hero nor villain in the traditional sense, but something far more unsettling. A product of violence who learned too late that violence does not negotiate endings. A witness whose truth reshaped institutions while sealing his own fate. Joseph Barboza did not leave behind a legacy anyone would want, but he left behind a lesson the underworld and the system both understood. Some men are too dangerous to trust. Some men know too much to protect. And when those truths collide, survival becomes temporary by design. The blood dries. The noise fades. The world moves on. But the shadow of what happened remains, stretching quietly across the spaces where fear once ruled. That is what remains after the blood. And that is the true end of Joseph, the animal Barboza.